Welcome to my review of the final problem. Oh boy, there was more than one problem with that episode. By the way, if I look hot and sweaty and just generally it's because it is 37 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's very warm. Before I start this review, I just want to say a massive thank you to anyone who subscribed to my channel because of my Sherlock reviews. And this won't be my last Sherlock critique though. I'm planning on doing a series of videos of like elementary versus Sherlock, of comparisons between different versions of Sherlock. So have no fear, I still will be uploading content about Sherlock Holmes here. Alright, so let's get on with this review. The final problem picks up sometime after The Lying Detective and opens with a scene of a little girl on a plane surrounded by unconscious drugged passengers, and she gets a tantalizing phone call from Jim Moriarty. Following this scene, we get Mycroft sitting at home apparently just watching old movies when he is subjected to a myriad of very stereotypical horror tropes such as clowns and bleeding portraits and corrupted old home movies. But before Mycroft can even really show us the skills he has with his secret umbrella sword slash handgun, the lights come up and it's revealed that all of that was a social experiment done by Sherlock to make Mycroft reveal that they have a sister. In this scene we see John, who when we last saw him had a gun pointing at his face, and he seems to be miraculously fine. That cliffhanger is just shaken off like many Sherlock cliffhangers with a sort of quippy one-liner. After this feeble, inconsistent introduction, the final problem sort of executes itself very comfortably within 3 acts. The first act being Mycroft's explanation as to how the brilliant Sherlock Holmes never knew he had a sister. The second act being some kind of weird hybrid of the Saw films and James Bond. And the third act being a sloppy, sentimental, anticlimactic conclusion to a once great and complex series. In Act 1, Mycroft explains why Sherlock never knew about Eurus, and his explanation is riddled with plot holes that the characters fall into as soon as they start fumbling their way to something akin to the truth. Euros, a year older than Sherlock, presented psychopathic tendencies from a very early age and an incandescent, era-defining intellect that in combination drove her to kill the family dog and burn their house to the ground. To protect himself from the trauma of these events, apparently a very young Sherlock Holmes deletes his sister from his memory. Mycroft also reveals that later on he told the parents that their daughter was dead and has been testing Sherlock's mental state through various trigger words, which, when you think about it, is a rather disturbing thing for a brother to do and is never addressed by either of the characters or any other characters by the end of the episode. Ultimately, the entire thing sounds like something the narrator in Jane the Virgin would have a giggle at and say something like, it's just like a telenovela. All of this expose is brought to a halt by the introduction of a drone and a sleeper grenade, which prompts the 3 men to have a sort of tender moment. They set off the grenade and Sherlock and John jump out of Baker Street, which is 2 stories high, while Mycroft apparently escapes down the stairs. Which brings us to Act 2. Our heroes, apparently completely unscathed by this literal bomb that went off in their apartment, commandeer a fishing boat to infiltrate the government facility known as Sherrington. This is where Mycroft has apparently been keeping Euros for so many years. He claims it's the place where he puts demons, and that of course includes Euros, because, you know, women aren't vilified enough in this series. We need to compare them to actual devils. And despite Mycroft's obvious power and sway in the government, he has to do a swashbuckling pirate kind of role play in order to break into the facility, so that Sherlock, disguised in nothing but a beanie, a coat, and a pretty shitty accent, get past the apparently really good security guards and finally come face to face with his sister. His sister Euros then reveals that she can hypnotize anyone given the appropriate amount of time with them, and implies that she has everybody in the building hypnotized. She then makes a really sort of inappropriate quip about Sherlock's sex life and her own, and then knocked him unconscious. A cleverly misleading flashback in which Andrew Scott steals the show as Jim Moriarty, who is simultaneously the show's best villain but also the one that has the least amount of screen time. The flashback reveals that 5 years ago Jim and Euros were granted 5 minutes conversation in which it's inferred that the entire events of season 2 and season 3 of Sherlock were planned. Interesting about this scene is that Mycroft summons Moriarty at will, and there doesn't seem to be any of the kind of tension that there was between them that is portrayed in series 2 or 3. The idea that it was impossible for Mycroft to sort of catch Moriarty, get a word out of him, but can summon him at will, visit his crazy sister in hospital, doesn't seem to match up. But when we return to the present, our 3 protagonists are locked inside a cell with the governor, who was the person in charge of this island. It's here where the second act gets into full swing, with Euros putting Sherlock, Mycroft and John through a series of fatally consequential psychological tests, utilising the lunatic in control of the asylum trope, and flinging the episode far out of the familiar territory of crime solving and into more Arkham Asylum meets Saw kind of territory. While I can openly admit that this type of storyline is something I definitely enjoy as a massive fan of the Batman Arkham games and as a massive fan of just social experimentation in general, I know that sounds a bit crazy, but I do enjoy reading about it. This storyline on its own is not so bad, but the trope feels out of place in Sherlock's clever crime-solving kind of vibe, and the explanation of these cheap, elaborate thrills are explained with the same level of attention as a maniacal James Bond villain. That is, no attention whatsoever. For instance, if Euros had control of all of the guards, why would she kill them? If she did kill them all, how on earth did she move 3 grown men on her own in a very short space of time? How did she transport 2 grown men from an island to the mainland to their ancestral home and then put one of them down the bottom of a well? And also, Euros's apparent obsession with Sherlock doesn't really make sense, given that Mycroft is the one who essentially locked her up and alienated her from her family. This unhinged focus on Sherlock is certainly not new. This idea in overly centering Sherlock has resulted in the categorization of all other characters in one of 3 categories: either A, people who want to mess with him, B, people who love him, and C, both. We now tend to know nothing about characters' lives outside of their connection to Sherlock, making the exploitation of these connections by Euros not only uncomfortable but also seemingly insignificant. For example, Sherlock is forced to say "I love you" to Molly, an act that we know would have serious emotional fallout, as we know Sherlock has exploited her feelings to use her throughout the entire series, literally from day 1. But none of that apparently has any bearing on the outcome of this episode, as when we next see Molly, she is smiling and happy, and again showing that the showrunners really don't give a crap about characters once they're outside of Sherlock's line of sight and don't think that they're important enough to give them a life outside of Sherlock. And yeah, Sherlock smashes up the coffin for a bit, but it's still more emphasizing his reaction than hers. His reaction is still valued over hers, and ultimately we don't see him apologize for what he did. And then Euros admits she was never in danger, which completely renders that whole scenario really irrelevant. In Euros's final asylum test, she gets Sherlock to choose between shooting his best friend and shooting Mycroft. Mycroft is the one who gives the scene the most sentimental weighting in the moment by trying to convince Sherlock to shoot himself by insulting him and his friendship with John Watson. The moment holds more emotional significance than anything in this season put together. Then, in a Hunger Games style climax, Sherlock decides to turn the gun on himself, but before he can pull the trigger, Euros tranquilizes him and he wakes up hours later in an unknown location with the girl on the plane still sort of sobbing in his ear. But he quickly works out that he's no longer at the bunker and is actually at his rebuilt childhood home that Euros initially burnt down, in a really obvious and kind of random reference to Skyfall. As it goes, John is chained at the bottom of a well, which Euros uses to trigger the repressed memory Sherlock has of her drowning Sherlock's childhood friend, Victor Trevor. revealing that Redbeard was never a dog, but was actually the code name Sherlock used when he was playing with his best friend. And to deal with the trauma of losing his best friend, he turned his friend into a dog. While this plot twist bestows a new meaning to Sherlock and John's friendship, it heralds the death of logic for anything that follows. Sherlock remembers his dad's allergy to dogs, despite the fact that it's never ever brought up once, and realizes the reason he is emotionally detached is because of that initial loss of his friend Victor. So Victor Trevor joins Irene Adler, Molly Hooper and Greg Lestrade as characters entirely underdeveloped outside the connection to Sherlock Holmes, which somewhat dampens his significance, especially when you think about the fact that Sherlock made him into a dog. The final addition to this never-ending parade of insignificant and confusing plot twists, it is revealed that Euros was the little girl in the plane all along and was manifesting a physical metaphor for her desire for friendship. One hug from her big brother and she throws down a rope, and presumably a key, though we never actually see it, to John and this psychopathic murderess whose body count is at least 20 people is completely and utterly neutralized. She also titles herself as Jim Moriarty's Revenge, a line that removes her agency as a villain and as a female character in the same way that Moffat did with Irene Adler in A Scandal in Belgravia. Moriarty's Did You Miss Me message, which was the massive cliffhanger for season 3, is also dismissed as a pre-recorded message Euros distributed via Moriarty's brother, who again we never heard of before this episode. They then lock Euros up in the same cell that she has casually been escaping from for years. Apparently she's not going to escape now because Sherlock hugged her and goes in there and plays violin with her. Also, she doesn't speak. Moffat and Gaddis prefer their women silent, clearly. Baker Street is put back together again quite easily. This is all sort of justified in the series' very hollow use of tautology and the sort of remarks of it is what it is, kind of brushing off the fact that none of this is justified or makes sense or is consistent in narrative or character for anybody. The episode concludes with a sort of hallmark Christmas card kind of montage narrated by Mary from Beyond the Grave in a DVD that she apparently sends to John that cures Sherlock and John of their apparent quarrels that we never see settled off screen, which makes me wonder why on earth did she bother with sending the DVD to Sherlock if this DVD was so inherently magical it could fix all the problems that they had. Why not send it to him initially? Who the heck knows? Perhaps the saving grace of this episode is the evolution of Mycroft as a character and the evolution of the relationship between him and Sherlock. The final problem feels more like his superhero origin story than it does an explanation of why Sherlock is the way he is. From the sword in his umbrella to his near sacrifice, Mark delivers an outstanding performance as Mycroft Holmes in this, probably his best. This really was Mycroft's episode in every sense of the word, and yet this is very rudely insulted when his parents reprimand him for his hubris while Sherlock escapes mostly unscathed, despite the fact that more or less this episode revealed that everything Mycroft has done up until this point has been to keep his family and younger siblings safe. While Sherlock doesn't need to face any of the consequences apparently from what happened in the asylum, including his phone call to Molly. And we are left with this kind of disturbing notion that the Holmes parents would rather dote on their pyromaniac psychopathic daughter than they would on their oldest son, who has done everything he can to protect his siblings. Also, this is made worse by the fact that that scene is the last we see of Mycroft Holmes and he is not part of the happy ever after montage that follows. It's this that kind of made the final problem a parody almost of Sherlock. The dramatic irony of Mycroft taking the blame for Euros and also therefore for what made Sherlock the way he is, i.e. his struggle with emotions, Sherlock's addiction to drugs and his general assholey demeanour. Mycroft takes on the blame for all those things and thus allows Sherlock to escape the episode with literally zero consequences. Euros is locked up, Molly and John are miraculously friends with Sherlock. Obviously we see them reconcile off screen because we sure as hell don't see it on screen, and all the women in the show are either dead or on the other end of a sexy phone call, silent and locked in prison, or unfazed by the horrible way they are treated by the men in the story. Moreover, actual significant emotional things that Sherlock has had to deal with throughout the series, such as his imprisonment for 2 years and being away for so long, and also his murder of Magnuson, are literally just forgotten, and in one case, in Magnuson's case, edited out of the story. The final problem is an inappropriately named episode because it causes and raises more problems than it seeks to actually solve. The episode feels out of place in the series, with little to no build up in the previous episodes of what we were going to have in this one, making the Six Thatchers and the Lying Detective look more like filler episodes, specifically made to weed out any characters they couldn't be bothered to deal with when it came to the Sherrington sequence. The genre nods to film noir and James Bond and horror and the Saw films did very little other than remove the show entirely from what made it initially appealing. It essentially made it feel like a fanboy's acid trip instead of a conclusion to a long-running TV series where the writers actually cared about the characters. It is ironic, really, that this series focused so much on the consequences of hubris, when ultimately it is the hubris of Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss. Their expectation that the audience will swallow whatever they give them is what makes this series awful. The major plot holes and the feebly justified plot twists don't stand up to what initially made the show appealing, and also makes Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat's claim that we've come full circle the most ironic thing about this episode. I want to quote Aja Romano from Vox magazine. Sherlock does its best to sell heartwarming final moments as a kind of hallmark card to its fans, a reminder that the game is always afoot and the legend of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson continues ever onward. But following the hallucinogenic confusion, fake memories and melodramatic plot twists that the rest of the final problem offers, the episode feels like a window dressing on a completely different story, the haunted, lonely opium dream of 3 Holmes children who will never be fully able to tap into different, more authentic versions of themselves. And I think that's a really good way of saying that up until this series, we were really looking at a series that was about solving crimes and how Sherlock and John are always best friends and always solve crimes and always save the day, and all of a sudden it was more orientated towards this family drama that John Watson seemed to sort of be sidled in with a throwaway line of, he is family. If you took John Watson out of this series, not a lot would change. In fact, it would probably get better. And just because I can, I just want to say to Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, creating a version of Irene Adler that was very complex. And you take this very complex character who essentially almost outsmarted 2 of the smartest men in the story, and you reduce her to nothing more than an apparent chink in Sherlock's sexless demeanour, which is just icky, really. I do want to say though, I do feel sorry for the John Locke shippers who are now realising what a shitty queerbaity show that we were telling them it was all along. However, I still don't think that the amount of bullying that they have done over the years to fandom, to the actors, to the writers, is justifiable at all. If you want a modern day version of Sherlock Holmes that actually cares about LGBT representation, that actually deals with sensitive issues like suicide, drug use, etc., with sensitivity and respect, please watch Elementary. I know that people that watch Sherlock love to bag on Elementary and love to make it out like it's this lesser version, but Elementary would never, has never, will never stoop so low as to write a melodramatic, disappointing ending like this, especially one that took 3 years to make. So thank you for coming with me on this journey and watching my reviews. If you did, I feel like an era is over now, regardless of whether it ended good or bad. All I have left to do now really is finish my series 4 fanfiction, which I started a year ago and then had a mental breakdown, and now I'm going back to writing. I'll put a link down to my Sherlock fanfiction if anyone wants to read it. It sort of very much focuses on giving the women of Sherlock the justice that they deserve. But thank you guys. I have met so many wonderful people, and even one of my best friends now is my friend because of this series. In the end, I'm still grateful for Sherlock. I'm grateful for the impact it had on my life and the impact that it's still having on my life. And with that, I bid you all adieu. Good night, good luck, farewell. But not forever. Like, I'm still gonna be here. I'm not gonna like vanish now that Sherlock's over. Thanks guys. Bye.